Continuiamo ad ascoltare Spare perché io sono curioso, voglio arrivare al punto dove c'è questa Meghan Markle perché ragazzi, secondo me, chiamatemi pazzo, ma l'indizio di cosa sia successo veramente a Kate lo troviamo qui. Non lo so come, ma secondo me è qua, ne sono convinto. Quindi, questa è tra l'altro l'ultimo episodio in cui l'ascoltiamo in 20 minuti e dal prossimo ritorno al formato di mezz'ora. Vi ricordo che anche se io lo ascolto con i sottotitoli in inglese perché sono gli unici disponibili, in italiano non si possono attivare in questo video che vedo io. Nel video che vedete voi, cioè quello che sto registrando per voi, voi potete attivare i sottotitoli in italiano andando in impostazioni, traduzione automatica e selezionate italiano. In questo modo voi potete guardare il mio video con i sottotitoli in italiano mentre Harry parla. E adesso continuiamo con la narrazione.
We ask him, "Did we really think this through, mate?" The remedy to all problems, as always, was work. Hard, sweaty, non-stop labor, that was what the hills had to offer, and plenty of it, and I couldn't get enough. The harder I worked, the less I felt the heat, and the easier it was to talk, or not talk, around the supper table. But this wasn't merely work. Being a jackaroo required stamina, to be sure, but it also demanded a certain artistry. You had to be a whisperer with the animals. You had to be a reader of the skies and the land. You also had to possess a superior level of horsemanship. I'd come to Australia thinking I knew my way around horses, but the hills were Huns, each born in a saddle. Noel was the son of a professional polo player. He'd been Pa's former polo coach, and he could stroke a horse's nose and tell you what that beast was thinking. And George climbed into a saddle more easily than most people get into their beds. A typical working day began in the middle of the night. Hours before dawn, George and I would stumble outside, tackle the first chores, trying to get as much done as possible before the sun ascended. At first light, we'd saddle up, gallop to the edges of the hill's 40,000 acres, double the size of Balmoral, and begin to muster. That is, move the herd of cattle from here to there. We'd also search for individual cows that had strayed overnight and drive them back into the herd, or load some onto a trailer and take them to another section. I rarely knew exactly why we were moving these cows or those, but I got the bottom line. Cows need their space. I felt them. Whenever George and I found a group of strays, a rebellious little cattle cabal, that was especially challenging, it was vital to keep them together. If they scattered, we'd be proper fucked. It would take hours to round them up and then the day would be wrecked. If one darted off into a stand of trees, say, George or I would have to ride full speed after it. Every now and then, mid-chase, you'd get whipped out of the saddle by a low-hanging branch, maybe knocked cold. When you came to, you'd do a check for broken bones, internal bleeding, while your horse stood morosely over you. The trick was never letting a chase last too long. Long chases wore out the cow, reduced its body fat, slashed its market value. Fat was money, and there was no margin for error with Aussie cattle, which had so little fat to begin with. Water was scarce, grass was scarce, and what...
Scusate, ma che palle di ascolto. Io non capisco come lui possa aver... Vabbè che non l'ha scritto lui. Ma che due coglioni, ma andiamo comunque sia quando tipo c'è qualcosa di succoso da raccontare, che me ne frega delle mucche, con tutto il rispetto. Quando arriva Meghan Markle, che due palle, il grasso delle mucche. Cioè veramente non aveva con cosa riempirlo sto libro. Ecco perché hanno tagliato 400 pagine e questo libro è di 400 pagine, cioè una quantità pari. Cioè è un po' noiosa come ascolto.
Little there was often...
Sono tentato di ascoltarlo con l'avanti veloce, cioè in produzione rapida.
got grubbed by kangaroos, which George and his family viewed as other people view rats. I always
Ma perché tutto questo ovviamente è il preludio a quando ci sarà Meghan Markle. Io lo so che le parti più interessanti saranno quando ci sarà lei. Però io non è che posso saltare non lo so quante ore fino a quando lei appare. Perché comunque sia è una cosa che io non faccio mai, quello di saltare le pagine dei libri e non vorrei tipo non capire qualche cosa perché anche se dubito fortemente, dubito, ehm, quando arriverà Meghan Markle se ci sono dei riferimenti a parti precedenti, però che veramente due coglioni di cioè descrizioni prolisse, lunghe. Non ho mai ascoltato un libro così noioso per questa parte, veramente. Spero che ne valga la pena, se no richiedo i soldi indietro. Cazzo, non l'ho comprato. Che soldi devo richiedere? Meglio che soldi. Vabbè, continuiamo ad ascoltare.
flinched and chuckled at the way George spoke to errant cattle. He harangued them, abused them, cursed them, favouring one curse word in particular, a word many people go a lifetime without using.
Fuck.
George couldn't go 5 minutes. Most people dive under a table when they hear this word, but for George it was the Swiss Army knife of language, endless applications and uses. He also made it sound almost charming with his Aussie accent. It was merely one of dozens of words in the complete George lexicon. For instance, a fat was a plump cow ready for slaughter. A steer was a young bull that should have been castrated, but hadn't been yet. A weaner was a calf newly split from its mother. A smoko was a cigarette break. Tucker was food. I spent a lot of late 2003 sitting high in the saddle, watching a weaner while sucking a smoko and dreaming of my next tucker. Sometimes hard, sometimes tedious, mustering could be unexpectedly emotional. Young females were easier, they went where you nudged them. But young males didn't care for being bossed around, and what they really didn't like was being split from their mums. They cried, moaned, sometimes charged you. A wildly swung horn could ruin a limb or sever an artery. But I wasn't afraid. Instead, I was empathetic, and the young males seemed to know. The one job I wouldn't do, the one piece of hard work I shied from, was snipping bulls. Every time George brought out that long shiny blade, I'd raise my hands. No, mate, can't do it. Suit yourself. At day's end, I'd take a scalding shower, eat a gargantuan supper, then sit with George on the porch, rolling cigarettes, sipping cold beers. Sometimes we'd listen to his small CD player, which made me think of Pa's Wireless. Or Hannah's. He and the other boy went to borrow another CD player. Often we'd just sit gazing into the distance. The land was so tabletop flat you could see thunderstorms brewing hours ahead of when they arrived, the first spidery bolts flicking the far-off land. As the bolts got thicker and closer, wind would race through the house, ruffling the curtains. Then the rooms would flutter with white light. The first thunderclaps would shake the furniture. Finally, the deluge. George would sigh. His parents would sigh. Rain was grass. Rain was fat. Rain was money. If it didn't rain, it also felt like a blessing, because after a windstorm, the clear sky would be peppered with stars. I'd point out to George what the gang in Botswana had pointed out to me. See that bright one next to the moon? That's Venus. And over there, that's Scorpius. Best place to see it is the southern hemisphere. And there's Pleiades. And that's Sirius, brightest star in the sky. And there's Orion, the hunter. All comes down to hunting, doesn't it? Hunters hunted. What's that, Harry? Nothing, mate. The thing I found endlessly mesmerizing about the stars was how far away.
Ovviamente si riferisce, secondo me, alla madre che è stata perseguitata, hunted, dai paparazzi. Sei in Australia, dall'altra parte del mondo. Vai avanti. Ma no, è un'ossessione perenne.
They all were. The light you saw was born hundreds of centuries ago. In other words, Looking at a star, you were looking at the past, at a time long before anyone you knew or loved had lived, or died, or disappeared. George and I usually hit the sack about 8:30. Often we were too tired to take off our clothes. I was no longer afraid of the dark. I craved it. I slept as if dead, woke as if reborn. Sore, but ready for more. There were no days off. Between the relentless work, the relentless heat, the relentless cows, I could feel myself being whittled down, lighter each morning by a kilo, quieter by a few dozen words. Even my British accent was being pared away. After 6 weeks, I sounded nothing like Willie and Per. I sounded more like George, and dressed a bit like him as well. I took to wearing a slouchy felt cowboy hat like his. I carried one of his old leather whips. Finally, to go with this new Harry, I acquired a new name. Spike. It happened like this. My hair had never fully recovered after I'd let my Eton schoolmates shave it. Some strands shot up like summer grass. Some lay flat, like lacquered hay. George often pointed at my head and said, "You look a right mess." But on a trip to Sydney, to see the Rugby World Cup, I'd made an official appearance at the Taronga Zoo, and I'd been asked to pose for a photo with something called an echidna, a cross between a hedgehog and an anteater. It had hard spiky hair, which was why the zookeepers named it Spike. It looked, as George would say, a right mess. More to the point, it looked like me, a lot like me. And when George happened to see a photo of me posing with Spike, he yelped, "Has that thing's got your hair." Thereafter, he never called me anything but Spike. And then my bodyguards took up the chorus. Indeed, they made Spike my code name on the radio. Some even printed up t-shirts, which they wore while guarding me. Spike 2003. Soon enough, my mates at home got wind of this new nickname and adopted it. I became Spike when I wasn't Has, or Baz, or Prince Jackaroo, or Harold, or Darling Boy, or Scrawny, a nickname given me by some palace staff. Identity had always been problematic, but with a half-dozen formal names and a full dozen nicknames, it was turning into a hall of mirrors. Most days I didn't care what people called me. Most days I thought, don't care who I am, so long as it's someone new, someone other than Prince Harry. But then an official package would arrive from London, from the palace, and the old me, the old life, the royal life, would come racing back. The packet usually arrived in the everyday mail, though sometimes it was under the arm of a new bodyguard. There was a constant changing of the guard, every couple of weeks, to keep them fresh and let them see their families. Inside the packet would be letters from Pa, office paperwork, plus some briefs about charities in which I was involved. All stamped, ATTARA Prince Harry of Wales. One day the package contained a series of memos from the palace comms team about a delicate matter. Mummy's former butler had penned a tell-all, which actually told nothing. It was merely one man's self-justifying, self-centering version of events. My mother once called this butler a dear friend, trusted him implicitly. We did too. Now this. He was milking her disappearance for money. It made my blood boil. I wanted to fly home, confront him. I phoned Pa, announced that I was getting on a plane. I'm sure it was the one and only conversation I had with him while I was in Australia. He, and then, in a separate phone call, Willie, talked me out of it. All we could do, they both said, was issue a united condemnation. So we did. Or they did. I had nothing to do with the drafting. Personally, I'd have gone much further. In measured tones, it called out the butler for his treachery and publicly requested a meeting with him to uncover his motives and explore his so-called revelations. The butler answered us publicly, saying he welcomed such a meeting, but not for any constructive purpose. To one newspaper he vowed, "I'd love to give them a piece of my mind." He wanted to give us a piece of his mind. I waited anxiously for the meeting. I counted the days. Of course it didn't happen. I didn't know why. I assumed the palace quashed it. I told myself, shame. I thought of that man as the one errant steer that got away that summer. I don't recall how I learned about the first man trying to sneak onto the farm. Maybe from George, while we were out mustering. I do remember that it was the local police who nabbed the intruder and got rid of him. December 2003. The police were pleased with themselves, but I was glum. I knew what was coming. Paps were like ants. There was never just one. Sure enough, the very next day, 2 more crept onto the farm. Time to go. I owed so much to the Hills. I didn't want to repay them by ruining their lives. I didn't want to be the cause of them losing the one resource more precious than water: privacy. I thanked them for 9 of the best weeks of my life and flew home, arriving just before Christmas. I went straight to a club my first night home. And the next night, and the next.
Cioè, addirittura la privacy è più importante dell'acqua. Vedete com'è? È proprio disfunzionale da morire. Tu prima di quando nasci e piangi perché l'ossigeno brucia i polmoni entrando, no? Attraverso il naso, la bocca. Tu richiedi privacy, non richiedi acqua.
The press thought I was still in Australia, and I decided their ignorance gave me carte blanche. One night I met a girl, chatted with her over drinks. I didn't know she was a page 3 girl. That was the accepted, misogynistic, objectifying term for young topless women featured each day on page 3 of Rupert Murdoch's The Sun.
E lui la usa.
I wouldn't have cared if I'd known. She seemed smart and fun. I left the club wearing a baseball cap. Paps everywhere. So much for carte blanche. I tried to blend into the crowd, walked casually down the road with my bodyguard. We went through St. James's Square and got into an unmarked police car. Just as we pulled away, a Mercedes with blacked-out windows jumped the pavement and swiped our car, nearly slamming head-on into the rear passenger door. We could see it coming, the driver not looking ahead, too busy trying to shoot photos. The story in the papers the next morning should have been about Prince Harry nearly being killed by a reckless pap. Instead, it was about Prince Harry meeting and supposedly kissing a page 3 girl, along with much frantic commentary about the horrors of the spare dating. Such a fallen woman. Third in line to the throne, dating her. The snobbery, the classism, was nauseating. The out-of-order priorities were baffling. But it all greatly enhanced my sense of joy and relief at running away. Again. Gap year, part 2. Days later I was on a plane to Lesotho. Better yet, it was decided that I could take along a mate. The plan once upon a time had been to go with Henna's. In his stead, I now asked George.
Quindi lui va dopo l'Australia, va in Lesotho e dopodiché ad un certo punto dovrebbe iniziare a fare il militare, perché dopo l'Australia mi ricordo che ha fatto il militare, no? Ora, vediamo quest'altro periodo militare, sarà un'altra narrazione interminabile, anche perché lì racconta dei talebani che ha ucciso.
Lesotho was beautiful, but also one of the grimmest places on earth. It was the epicenter of the global AIDS pandemic, and in 2004 the government had just declared a medical disaster. Tens of thousands had fallen to the disease, and the nation was turning into one vast orphanage. Here and there you'd glimpse young children running about, lost looks on their faces. Where's Daddy? Where's Mummy? George and I signed up to help at several charities and schools. We were both bowled over by the lovely people we met, their resilience, their grace, their courage and good cheer in the face of so much suffering. We worked as hard as we'd worked on his farm, gladly and eagerly. We built schools. We repaired schools. We mixed gravel, poured cement, whatever was needed. In this same spirit of service, I agreed one day to perform a task that might otherwise have been unthinkable: an interview. If I truly wanted to shine a light on conditions here, I had no choice. I'd have to cooperate with the dreaded press. But this was more than cooperating. This would be my first ever solo session with a reporter. We met on a grassy hillside early one morning. He started by asking, "Why this place? Of all places?" I said that children in Lesotho were in trouble, and I loved children, understood children, so naturally I wanted to help. He pressed, "Why did I love children?" I gave my best guess. My incredible immaturity. I was being glib, but the reporter chuckled and moved on to his next question. The subject of children had opened the door to the subject of my childhood, and that was the gateway to the only subject he, or anyone, really wanted to ask me about. Do you think about, a lot through something like this? I looked off, down the hillside, responded with a series of disjointed words. Unfortunately, it's been a long time now. Not for me, but for most people. It's been a long time since she's died. But the stuff that's come out has been bad. All the stuff that's come out, all these tapes. I was referring to recordings my mother had made before her death, a kind of quasi-confessional, which had just been leaked to the press, to coincide with release of the butler's memoir. 7 years after being hounded into hiding, my mother was still being hounded, and libeled. It didn't make sense. In 1997, there'd been a nationwide reckoning, a period of collective remorse and reflection among all Britons. Everyone had agreed that the press was a pack of monsters, but consumers accepted blame as well. We all needed to do better, most people said. Now, many years later, all was forgotten. History was repeating itself daily, and I told the reporter it was a shame. Not a momentous declaration, but it represented the first time that either Willie or I had ever spoken publicly about money. I was amazed to be the one going first. Willie always went first, in all things, and I wondered how this would go over, with him, with the world, but especially with Per. Not well, Marco told me later. Per was dead set against me addressing that topic. He didn't want either of his sons speaking about money, for fear it would cause a stir, distract from his work, and perhaps shine an unflattering light.
Ma è la loro madre, scusami, come cazzo fai a dirmi non... Ma poi... Con tutti gli scheletri nell'armadio che chissà che avrà Re Carlo, allora principe, la regina Elisabetta, si possono permettere di dire al loro figlio, al figlio di Diana, non parlare di tua madre. Non parlarne tu, Carlo.
Light on Camilla. Finally, with a completely false air of bravado, I shrugged and said to the reporter, "Bad news sells." Simple as that. Speaking of bad news, the reporter now referenced my most recent scandal. The page 3 girl, of course. He mentioned that some were wondering if I'd really learned anything from my visit to the rehab clinic. Had I truly converted? I don't remember if he used that word, converted, but at least one paper had. Did Harry need to be converted? Harry the heretic? I could barely make out the reporter through the sudden red mist. How are we even talking about this? I blurted something about not being normal, which caused the reporter's mouth to fall open. Here we go. He was getting his headline, his news fix. Were his eyes rolling up into his head? And I was supposed to be the addict. I explained what I meant by normal. I didn't lead a normal life, because I couldn't lead one. Even my father reminds me that unfortunately Willie and I can't be normal. I told the reporter that no one but Willie understood what it was like.
Ma volesse il cielo che anche noi avessimo una vita non normale, con tutti i privilegi che ti becchi. Soltanto lui può parlare così di essere principe, perché non mi pare che comunque sia, adesso che... No, ora sono polemico, sì, ora sono polemico. Non mi pare che con tutta questa cosa che non può essere normale, adesso che lui se ne è uscito da famiglia reale, stia ricercando una vita normale. Perché se ricercasse una vita normale si prenderebbe una casa di 4 stanze, no? o in un appartamento, vivrebbe con altri condomini. Invece to se ne va a vivere con uno stile di vita forse più lussuoso di quello del resto della sua famiglia, perché altro che vita normale, lui non vuole essere normale. Che gran presa per il culo che si fa alle persone disattente, perché questa è tutta propaganda, questo è tutto populismo. Noi non possiamo essere normali. Certo che non potete essere normali, perché siete meglio delle persone normali, perché avete privilegi. Perché per contratto voi siete ricchi dalla nascita, non sapete che cos'è il lavoro vero e poi vi permettete di fare tutto quello che fate a spese dei contribuenti, a spese dei sudditi, che per carità, ultimamente la monarchia fa molto da quando hanno cambiato il sistema, però comunque sia, il contratto è sempre che loro, cioè, queste persone non sanno che cosa vuol dire pagare la rata del mutuo o pagare la rata della macchina. O che ne so, decidere fra un'attività e l'altra perché non si possono permettere, che ne so, di fare calcetto e nuoto, o devono decidere o l'uno o l'altro. Non sanno che cosa vuol dire aspettare di prendere lo stipendio per andare a fare shopping, per comprarsi, per rifarsi il guardaroba, perché c'hanno gli addetti del guardaroba. Quindi non è una vita normale, ovvio, ma in che senso non è una vita normale? Cioè, se fanno una scorreggia va pure sul New York Times. Sì, ma c'è un pro e contro di tutto. Vittimismo, quanto vittimismo. Facciamo cambio, Harry. Vengo io a fare la vita non normale. Vengo io. E tu vieni qua.
To live in this surreal fishbowl, in which normal events were treated as abnormal, and the abnormal was routinely normalized. That was what I was trying to say, starting to say, but then I took another look down the hillside. Poverty, disease, orphans, death. It rendered everything else rubbish. In Lesotho, no matter what you were going through, you were well off compared to others. I suddenly felt ashamed, and wondered if the journalist had sense enough to be ashamed too. Sitting here above all this misery and talking about page 3 girls? Come on. After the interview, I went and found George and we drank beer. A lot of beer. Gallons of beer. I believe that was also the night I smoked an entire shopping bag of weed. I don't recommend it. Then again,
Per esempio, la gente normale si prende un pezzettino e fa e mischia col tabacco. Magari lui se lo fuma puro perché tanto, no? Dici, come lo sai tu, Fabio? Sapeste. Vabbè, comunque, terminiamo qui la lettura di questa povera persona anormale. Eh, saluti reali, alla prossima. Che qua la cosa si fa sempre più polposa. Secondo me Meghan Markle è dietro l'angolo. Saluti reali.